This is the 2025 MCL39, but if you are racing, the rear wing is the only thing you'll see.
As Oscar Piastri for the first time in Formula One.
In fact, this is perhaps the best Formula One car ever designed, and the massive question is, why can no one beat McLaren in 2025? Is it the car? Have the other teams failed? And how does one team finally plan to break McLaren's stronghold in this year? Since the first season of the 21st century, one team has always stood head and shoulders above the competition. First there was the Ferrari F2002, later perfected into the rocket ship that was the F2004. This dominance would move to Brawn GP for one season, before shifting to Red Bull, who dominate Formula One from 2010 to 2013. New regulation changes meant new cars, and this time Mercedes was the dominant force, leaving a trail of dust in their wake as both Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton absolutely destroyed the rest of the grid for the next 7 years. Then there was the Mercedes-AMG F1 W11 EQ Performance, the only car that could take the famous Pouhon corner at Spa flat out. Mercedes' dominance would finally come to an end when Max Verstappen did the unthinkable. This was the rise of a new era, where cars relied more on ground effect, and by the following year when Red Bull designed the RB19, no one would even come close. In fact, Max Verstappen broke record after record, winning races by a whopping 20 seconds, not over his rivals but over his teammates. It was an era from 2022 to 2024. Some loved it, others hated it, while many fans called it boring. But something changed midway through 2024. A new team rose from the ashes, challenging the dominant Red Bull, and this was none other than the McLaren MCL38. Call it bad strategy or bad driving, but Lando could never truly extract the full potential of the car, and Verstappen would once again win the championship. Fortunately, McLaren would walk away with the Constructors' title, which brings us to exactly where we are now. Midway through 2024, something was brewing at McLaren. The team brought a package of highly effective upgrades specifically to the suspension and the underfloor. This not only gave the car more downforce, but it was done in a way that completely eliminated any real drag. Well, at least for the moment, as the Papaya outfit is once again struggling with it in 2025. Most of all, it was the introduction of a new suspension, one that allowed not only the car to run a lower ride height, but focused on protecting the tyres. Essentially, McLaren would be able to take high-speed corners at a much faster speed, while less sliding from the car would protect the tyres. This proved vital at warmer tracks, where the tyres could remain cooler, and even though Verstappen was keeping close to the McLaren, he simply ran out of tyres. Unfortunately, cooler tracks like Canada is where the McLaren loses some of its advantage, as was seen at the 2025 Canadian Grand Prix, where neither McLaren could even make it onto the podium. Nevertheless, the MCL39 has proven a very fast and reliable car, one that will likely remain dominant up to the regulation change in 2026. And with a driver like Oscar Piastri at the helm, it doesn't seem like anyone could deny the young Aussie his maiden World Championship in 2025. Well, perhaps Lando could, but a streak of inconsistent performances has made many fans question how good Lando truly is. So, what about the opposition? Are Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull simply accepting defeat? First, Ferrari have been slowly introducing upgrades, and Fred Vasseur, Ferrari team principal, believes that many of these upgrades would have a decent effect on the performance of the car. First, there is the smaller gearbox for the 2025 car, which pushes the cockpit deeper into the same wheelbase as 2024. Then there is the new floor, which should have added a lot more performance following its introduction at the 2025 Austrian Grand Prix. But a few setup issues have been hampering the Scuderia, often forcing them to run the ride height much higher and sacrifice performance. Essentially, it is a brilliant idea, but hard to execute, and has slowly left Ferrari battling just to get on the podium. Then there is the Mercedes. The car itself is actually a masterpiece, but it is exactly the opposite of the McLaren. Instead of being brilliant in hot conditions, these tracks like Barcelona have proven a real challenge for Mercedes. In fact, the only place really conducive to the Mercedes is the cooler conditions of both Montreal, and the little bit of rain also helped at Silverstone. However, the hotter conditions of most tracks, especially those in the Middle East, have proven a bit tricky for Mercedes, costing them tons of points in the championship. This brings us to the final team in the top 4, Red Bull. Unfortunately, not a lot is to be said about the Austrian manufacturer, and with the car being completely in disarray, often not even competing with either Ferrari or Mercedes, it doesn't really pose a significant threat to the McLaren. Yes, a new floor upgrade was expected to fix some of these issues, especially in the high-speed corners, but this didn't really come to fruition, and following Max bottling a safety car restart, not a lot could be said for how competitive Red Bull hopes to be for the rest of the season. This doesn't even begin to cover the storm currently faced by the team, with the sacking of Christian Horner and the possibility of Max Verstappen leaving for Mercedes. So it seems like McLaren can simply coast through the rest of the season and win the championship long before anyone has even begun catching up, which leaves us with a very interesting question. Since the MCL39 is incredible in hot conditions, with Red Bull even claiming that the team has been cheating by adding water to their tyres, it doesn't seem very likely that other teams will even come close in 2025. Rainy conditions and cooler temperatures might be the only bet for the opposition, but as tracks like Kota, Mexico, Qatar and even Abu Dhabi are still to come, it might be impossible for anyone to match the McLaren in these conditions. But Ferrari might have a solution. Following the introduction of a new suspension at the British Grand Prix, Lewis and Charles have been slowly closing the gap to McLaren. Since the race was run in horrendous conditions, no one truly knew the outright pace of how much this new rear suspension would perform. In fact, the new suspension already emanates from Austria, where both Ferraris finished in P3 and P4 respectively, adding even more suspicion that perhaps the Scuderia have things figured out. However, the Ferrari will need to focus on keeping the floor in the optimal position, which could allow the car to run a much lower ride height. This will significantly improve performance and could allow either Lewis or Charles to put the car in pole position on Saturday. Now, given the fact that McLaren doesn't truly enjoy following, this can be used as a strategy to slowly wear down the tyres of each McLaren, but would require both Ferrari drivers to be at the top of their game. Unfortunately, Lewis Hamilton has been struggling to figure out the right setup, while Charles is driving the car at the absolute limit of what the setup could allow. This is not likely to happen in 2025, with McLaren already having more than double the points in the constructors of their competitors. However, the focus might shift to 2026, where everything is reset and Ferrari could gain a slight edge in development. But what will happen in reality? One of the advantages of leading the championship by such a significant amount is that a team can shift their focus to next year's car much sooner. Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull will all be battling it out for P2 in the title fight, meaning they need to continue developing the 2025 car. However, the allocation of wind tunnel hours and CFD time is where things often change. Since the team leading the championship is significantly limited to receiving these benefits, it allows weaker teams to come to the forefront. It is this exact system that has made it possible historically for midfield teams like McLaren to build cars that compete at the highest level. Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull will likely have to tap into this to ensure they gain a slight edge in development and catch up with the walloping McLaren. Now, this could all change given the pace at which F1 moves, and if Verstappen moves to Mercedes, the British team could gain that extra boost that perhaps allows it to compete for a world title.